Hello everyone, I'm the Story Keeper, and I'm here to help you relax and fall asleep. Before we get into it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from? And what time is it where you're watching? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, relax, and let the story unfold through me. The road to Hollow Pines National Park felt like a portal to another world. As Ethan Hayes navigated the narrow, winding highway, he couldn't shake the sense that he was leaving something behind, not just the hum of modern life, but a part of himself as well. The forest stretched endlessly on both sides, dense with towering pines and skeletal birches whose branches twisted upward like desperate fingers. It was late autumn, and the air had grown sharp with the promise of winter. Frost edged the tips of the leaves, and patches of mist clung stubbornly to the roadside. Ethan rolled down his window briefly, letting the brisk air rush into the car. It carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth, grounding him in a way nothing else could. This was what he'd always wanted: solitude, peace, a chance to reset. The posting had been almost too perfect to believe. Seeking experienced park ranger for a long-term wilderness position. Remote, self-sufficient, and adaptable candidates preferred. The simplicity of the ad had hooked Ethan immediately. He wasn't running away from anything at least, that's what he told himself. He just needed a change. City life had worn him thin, and the buzz of fluorescent lights and distant sirens had long since lost their charm. Hollow Pines promised the kind of escape he craved, acres of untouched wilderness, trails that stretched beyond the horizon, and a job that demanded both his expertise and his patience. But now, as the miles stretched on and the road grew narrower, Ethan felt a creeping unease. His phone had lost signal nearly an hour ago, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became, as though the forest was swallowing every sound. Even the hum of his car's engine felt muffled, like he was moving through a dream. Ethan glanced at the map spread across the passenger seat. The ranger station wasn't far, just another 10 miles, according to the hand-drawn directions he'd received. Still, the forest felt endless, and the sinking sun painted the road in shadows that seemed to move with him. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, focusing on the faint crunch of gravel as his tires veered onto a narrower, unpaved stretch. When he finally saw the sign for the ranger station, relief washed over him. Hollow Pines National Park Ranger Station. The words were etched into a weathered wooden plank, its edges smoothed by years of wind and rain. Beneath it, someone had scratched a warning in faded letters: "The Forest Watches." Ethan parked his car in the small lot, his tires crunching against loose gravel. The ranger station stood ahead, a modest building with slanted eaves and a wide front porch. Its wooden walls were dark with age, and the single light above the door flickered faintly in the growing dusk. To the right of the station, a smaller cabin sat nestled against the edge of the tree line. Its windows were dark, and a thin curl of smoke rose lazily from the chimney. As Ethan stepped out of the car, the chill in the air hit him immediately. He pulled his jacket tighter around him, taking a moment to absorb his surroundings. The forest loomed on all sides, its shadows deepening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and earth, and a faint rustling sound whispered from somewhere in the underbrush. "Quiet," Ethan murmured to himself, his breath fogging in the cold air. Too quiet. He approached the station, his boots crunching against the gravel path. The silence felt oppressive, as though the forest were holding its breath. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the dimly lit interior. Inside, the ranger station smelled of old wood, stale coffee, and something faintly metallic. A single overhead light cast a warm but weak glow over the room, highlighting the cluttered desk and the corkboard behind it. Maps, photographs, and handwritten notes covered the board, their edges curling with age. A two-way radio sat on the desk, crackling faintly with static, though no voices came through. Seated behind the desk was Gene Harper, the outgoing head ranger. Gene looked up as Ethan entered, his expression a mixture of curiosity and weariness. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with a sun-withered face and a thick grey beard. His uniform was well worn, the fabric faded and patched in places. "You must be Hayes," Gene said, standing and extending a hand. His voice was gravelly, but there was a warmth to it. "That's me," Ethan replied, shaking his hand. Gene's grip was firm, his calloused palm rough against Ethan's. "Welcome to Hollow Pines," Gene said, motioning for Ethan to sit in one of the wooden chairs near the desk. "Hope you're ready for some quiet. You'll be getting plenty of it out here. That's the plan," Ethan said with a small smile. "It's beautiful out here, remote, but beautiful." Gene chuckled, though the sound carried a hint of something Ethan couldn't quite place. "Yeah, it's something all right, but don't let the peace fool you. This place has its quirks." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, leaning forward. Gene hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the window behind Ethan. "You'll see soon enough. Most of the time, it's just you, the trails, and the wildlife. But every now and then, the forest reminds you that it's bigger than you, older than you, and it doesn't always play nice." Ethan frowned. "Are you trying to spook me?" Gene shook his head. "No, just giving you fair warning. Stick to the trails, keep your radio close, and don't go poking around where you don't belong. The forest has its rules." "What kind of rules?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. Jean met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You'll learn." After going over the basics patrol schedules, emergency protocols, and the locations of key landmarks, Gene handed Ethan a set of keys. "These are for the cabin," he said, nodding toward the smaller building near the tree line. "It's not much, but it's cozy. Should have everything you need." "Thanks," Ethan said, slipping the keys into his pocket. Gene stood, extending a hand once more. "Good luck out there, Hayes. And remember, if you hear something calling your name, don't answer." Ethan laughed nervously. "You're serious?" Gene's expression didn't waver. Serious as a heart attack. The cabin was small, but inviting, its interior lit by the warm glow of a single overhead bulb. The main room contained a wood-burning stove, a kitchenette, and a small table with 2 chairs. The bedroom was barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, but it was clean and smelled faintly of cedar. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside the stove, and a bookshelf in the corner held a mix of old field guides and paperback novels. Ethan spent the evening unpacking and settling in. He made a quick dinner of canned soup and toast, then sat on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the forest darken. The trees cast long, skeletal shadows under the faint light of the crescent moon, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. The forest seemed to change at night. The stillness felt heavier, the shadows deeper. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its mournful call echoing through the trees. Ethan sipped his tea, letting the quiet envelop him. But as the night stretched on, the silence became oppressive. Ethan found himself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement. The thought made him chuckle nervously. He was letting Gene's warnings get to him. After finishing his tea, Ethan went inside, locking the door behind him. He drew the curtains and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to his chin. The mattress was firm, but he was too tired to care. Sleep came quickly, though it was restless. Sometime in the night, Ethan awoke to a sound, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. His eyes snapped open, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. But the sound was gone, leaving only the heavy silence of the forest. Ethan woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the curtains. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The cabin's wooden ceiling, the faint scent of cedar, and the distant sound of birds were a stark contrast to the urban chaos he'd left behind. He sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The strange whisper he'd thought he'd heard during the night seemed distant now, like a fading dream. The morning chill nipped at his skin as he swung his legs out of bed and reached for the thermal shirt he'd left draped over the chair. The cabin was colder than he expected, and he made a mental note to stoke the fire earlier tonight. After dressing, he brewed a quick pot of coffee on the stovetop, the rich aroma filling the small space. With the mug in hand, he stepped onto the porch. The forest was alive with the sounds of morning. Birds flitted between branches, their songs piercing the crisp air. A light mist hung low over the ground, curling around the base of the trees like a living thing. Ethan sipped his coffee, letting the warmth spread through him as he took in the view. Despite Jean's cryptic warnings, there was something undeniably serene about this place. The serenity was short-lived. Ethan's radio crackled to life, startling him enough that he nearly spilled his coffee. "Hayes, you there?" Jean's voice came through, rough and distorted but clear enough to understand. Ethan set his mug on the porch railing and grabbed the radio from his belt. "Yeah, I'm here." "Good," Jean replied. "How'd your first night go?" "Fine," Ethan said, hesitating. He considered mentioning the whisper, but decided against it. "Quiet," Jean chuckled. "Don't get too comfortable. Quiet doesn't always mean safe out here." Ethan frowned, but said nothing. "Start your patrol on the East Trail," Jean continued. "There's a hiker who checked in yesterday morning and hasn't come back yet. Probably nothing, but we need to make sure they didn't get lost." "Got it," Ethan said, already heading back inside to grab his gear. "And Hayes," Jean added, his tone turning serious. "Stay on the trail, no matter what." The radio clicked off before Ethan could respond. The East Trail was one of the longest in the park, winding through dense forest and crossing several streams before looping back toward the ranger station. Ethan followed the path carefully, his boots crunching against the frost-dusted ground. The morning mist clung to the air, blurring the edges of the trees and giving the forest an otherworldly quality. As he walked, he scanned the area for any sign of the missing hiker. Broken branches, discarded items, footprints, anything that might indicate someone had passed through recently. But the trail remained undisturbed, save for the occasional squirrel darting across his path. About an hour into his patrol, Ethan came across a small clearing. The grass here was trampled, as if someone or something had lingered. He crouched down, examining the area more closely. A single footprint stood out in the soft earth, its edges blurred but unmistakable. "Gotcha," Ethan muttered, reaching for his radio. "Jean, I've got a footprint on the East Trail. Looks fresh." The radio crackled, but no response came. Ethan frowned and tried again. "Jean, you there?" Nothing. He glanced around, the silence suddenly feeling heavier. The forest had gone still, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves conspicuously absent. A chill ran down his spine as he stood, gripping the radio tightly. "Probably just a dead zone," he said to himself, trying to shake off the unease. He marked the location on his map and continued down the trail, his eyes scanning the ground for more footprints. The deeper he went, the thicker the mist became, until it felt like he was walking through a dream. Shapes loomed in the fog trees, boulders, the occasional fallen log butt. Their outlines were distorted, shifting as he moved. Ethan found himself gripping the straps of his pack tighter, his breathing shallow. Then he heard it, faint at first, like the distant murmur of a stream. But as he listened, the sound grew clearer. It wasn't water. It was a voice. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his own voice echoing faintly. He strained to hear, but the voice stopped. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding. It could be the hiker, he told himself. Maybe they'd wandered off the trail and needed help. Against his better judgment, he stepped off the path, following the direction of the sound. The underbrush was thick, slowing his progress. Branches clawed at his arms and legs as he pushed through, the mist clinging to him like a second skin. The voice came again, closer now. It was faint and indistinct, but it sounded like someone calling for help. "Where are you?" Ethan shouted, his voice shaky. No response. He pressed on, the forest growing darker despite the midday hour. The trees seemed to close in around him, their trunks gnarled and twisted. His breath came in short bursts, visible in the cold air. Finally, he emerged into another clearing. It was small, barely more than a gap in the trees, but something about it felt wrong. The grass here was flattened, forming a strange spiral pattern. At the center of the spiral lay a single boot, its laces frayed and its leather scuffed. Ethan approached cautiously, his pulse racing. He crouched down, examining the boot. It was empty. A rustling sound behind him made him spin around, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. The forest was silent, the mist swirling lazily in the air. There was no sign of anyone or anything. "Hello?" he called out again, his voice cracking. The rustling came again, this time to his left. Ethan turned, his grip tightening on the knife. His heart thundered in his chest as he scanned the trees, but the mist made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on him like a weight. Ethan stood frozen, his senses on high alert. After what felt like an eternity, he forced himself to move. He marked the location of the clearing on his map and began retracing his steps back to the trail. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made him jump, but he refused to look back. He kept his focus on the path ahead, determined to leave the clearing behind. When he finally reached the trail, the forest seemed to exhale. The mist began to lift, and the familiar sounds of birds and distant streams returned. Ethan let out a shaky breath, his grip on the knife loosening. He radioed Jean again, and this time, the older ranger responded immediately. "You sound out of breath. Hey, everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, found a clearing off the east trail. Something strange. A boot. Flattened grass in a spiral pattern. "Didn't see anyone, but I thought I heard it." "Don't go back," Jean interrupted, his voice sharp. "Mark it on the map and leave it alone." "Why? What's out there?" Ethan asked, his frustration mounting. "Just listen to me, Hayes. Some places in this park aren't meant to be disturbed. You'll thank me later." Ethan clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. "Understood. Good," John said, his tone softening slightly. "Head back to the station. We'll go over your patrol when you get here." Ethan sighed, slipping the radio back onto his belt. As he continued down the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him. Every shadow, every gust of wind felt charged with intent. He told himself it was just his imagination, a side effect of Jean's cryptic warnings and the strange events of the day. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. Ethan didn't mention the clearing to Jean when he returned to the station that afternoon. The older ranger had been busy updating the park's logbook, and Ethan didn't feel like pressing the subject, especially not after Jean's curt warning over the radio. Instead, Ethan handed over his marked-up map, detailing the areas he'd patrolled and the exact location of the spiral-patterned clearing. Jean studied the map in silence, his weathered fingers tracing the edges of the spiral's location. He didn't ask questions, didn't press for details. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, almost dismissive. "Good work. I'll take it from here. You're not curious about what I found?" Ethan asked, unable to keep the frustration out of his voice. Jean set the map aside and looked up at him. "Let me give you some advice, Hayes. The forest doesn't always give you answers, and it doesn't owe you any, either. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is let things lie." Ethan frowned, but nodded. He could tell it was the end of the conversation. Still, as he returned to his cabin that evening, Jean's words gnawed at him. Let things lie. Was that supposed to be comforting? The cabin felt colder than usual when Ethan stepped inside. He stoked the fire in the wood-burning stove, watching the flames lick at the dry logs until they roared to life. The warmth helped chase away the chill that had settled in his bones, but it didn't ease his mind. He made a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast, his movements automatic as his thoughts lingered on the day's events. The voice he'd heard in the mist, the spiral in the clearing, the boot left behind it, all felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. And yet, there was something familiar about it too, as if the forest was trying to tell him something. After dinner, Ethan sat at the small table by the window, a steaming mug of tea in hand. The forest outside was cloaked in darkness, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Every so often, a branch would creak or the leaves would rustle, but otherwise, the night was still. It was a comforting kind of quiet, at least at first. But as the hours stretched on, the silence began to weigh on him. It was too perfect, too complete, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Ethan glanced at the notebook Jean had given him, its pages filled with scrawled notes from previous rangers. Most of the entries were mundane trail maintenance reports, wildlife sightings, weather updates. But as he flipped through the pages, he noticed something odd. Several entries had been crossed out, their words scratched through with thick, jagged lines. In some places, the paper was torn clean through, leaving only fragmented phrases visible. "Don't go back," "spiral patterns," "hear them at night." A chill ran down Ethan's spine as he stared at the ruined pages. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, as if the person writing had been in a hurry or afraid. He closed the notebook, setting it aside. It was probably nothing, he told himself. Just the ramblings of someone who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But that night, as Ethan lay in bed, the whispers returned. It started as a faint sound, like the rustling of leaves. Ethan stirred, half asleep, thinking it was just the wind. But as the noise grew louder, more distinct, he realized it wasn't leaves at all. It was a voice as soft, almost melodic, but unmistakably human. Ethan, his eyes snapped open, his heart pounding in his chest. The voice came again, closer this time. Ethan. He sat up slowly, straining to listen. The voice was faint, muffled, as though it were coming from just outside the cabin. He glanced toward the window, but the curtains were drawn, and he couldn't see anything beyond them. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The whispers stopped. Ethan held his breath, his ears straining for any sound. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that felt alive with anticipation. After a few moments, he swung his legs out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. The beam of light cut through the darkness as he approached the window. He hesitated for a moment before pulling back the curtain. The forest beyond was still, bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of anyone or anything. Ethan let the curtain fall back into place, his grip tightening on the flashlight. His pulse was still racing, his mind grasping for an explanation. Maybe it was just his imagination, or the wind playing tricks on him. But deep down, he didn't believe that. The next morning, Ethan decided to confront Jean. The older ranger was already at the station when Ethan arrived, hunched over a mat spread across the desk. He looked up as Ethan entered, his expression unreadable. "You look like hell," Jean said. "Rough night. Did you hear anything last night?" Ethan asked, ignoring the comment. Jean raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Voices," Ethan said. "Whispers. Someone calling my name." For a moment, Jean didn't respond. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he let out a long breath before speaking. "I told you, Hayes. The forest has its rules." "That's not an answer," Ethan said, his frustration boiling over. "What's out there, Jean? What aren't you telling me?" Jean leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "You want the truth. Fine. There are places in this park that aren't meant to be explored, places where the rules of nature don't apply. I don't know what you heard last night, but if the forest is calling your name, you'd better start listening." "To what?" Ethan demanded. "To the whispers, to the things hiding in the trees. I need more than cryptic warnings, Jean." Jean's expression softened, though his tone remained firm. "You need to understand something, Hayes. This isn't just a park. It's alive. It sees you, hears you, remembers you. And if you don't respect it, it'll chew you up and spit you out." Ethan stared at him, unsure whether to feel angry or terrified. Jean's words sounded insane, but there was an edge of sincerity to them that Ethan couldn't ignore. "Just do your job," Jean said finally. "Stick to the trails, keep your head down, and don't go looking for trouble. The forest will take care of the rest." Ethan spent the rest of the day patrolling the western edge of the park, his thoughts heavy with Jean's words. The forest felt different now, as though it were watching him more closely. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge. He kept his radio close, half expecting Jean to call with another cryptic warning. As the sun dipped low in the sky, Ethan found himself standing at the edge of a clearing. The grass here was tall and wild, swaying gently in the breeze. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal arms. Ethan approached cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry grass. Something about the tree felt wrong, though he couldn't quite place it. Its bark was dark and cracked, oozing a thick sap-like substance that glistened in the fading light. He reached out to touch it, then stopped. The air around the tree seemed colder, and a faint sound reached his ears' whispers, carried on the wind. "Ethan," he stepped back, his pulse quickening. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and clashing in a chaotic symphony. Ethan turned and ran, the whispers chasing him into the trees. Ethan didn't stop running until he was well past the tree line, his lungs burning and his legs trembling from exertion. He collapsed against a nearby boulder, gasping for breath as he glanced over his shoulder. The forest loomed behind him, its shadows deeper now that the sun was setting. The gnarled tree at the center of the clearing was nowhere in sight, hidden by the tangle of branches and mist. For a moment, All he could hear was the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then the whispers returned faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. They seemed to echo from every direction, rising and falling in a strange rhythm that made his skin crawl. Ethan fumbled for the radio clipped to his belt. "Jean," he said, his voice shaky. "I'm hearing something. Voices." The radio crackled, but there was no response. "Jean, come in," Ethan shouted, his panic mounting. The static on the other end grew louder, almost deafening. Ethan winced, holding the radio away from his ear. Just as he was about to give up, Jean's voice broke through. "Hayes," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Where are you?" Ethan glanced around, trying to get his bearings. The trees all looked the same, and the fading light made it difficult to tell one direction from another. I'm near the West Trail, I think. I don't know. Stay where you are," Jean said. "I'll find you." Ethan let out a shaky breath, clutching the radio like a lifeline. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, weaving through the trees like an invisible presence. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the forest itself was watching him. It was nearly dark by the time Jean arrived, his flashlight cutting through the gloom like a beacon. Ethan stood and waved, relief flooding through him as the older ranger approached. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Jean said, eyeing him carefully. "Maybe I have," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible. He gestured toward the forest. "There's something out there, Jean. I don't know what it is, but it's not normal." Jean didn't respond right away. Instead, he scanned the area with his flashlight, his expression unreadable. "Let's get back to the station," he said finally. "We can talk there." Ethan wanted to press him for answers, but he was too exhausted to argue. He followed Jean back to the main trail, the beam of the older ranger's flashlight guiding the way. The whispers seemed to fade as they walked, replaced by the more familiar sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. When they reached the station, Jean poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Ethan. The warmth of the mug was a welcome comfort, but it did little to calm his nerves. "You want to tell me what happened out there?" Jean asked, sitting across from him at the small table. Ethan took a sip of coffee, trying to collect his thoughts. "I heard voices," he said finally. "Whispers. They were calling my name." Jean nodded, as though this were nothing out of the ordinary. "Did you see anything?" "No," Ethan said. "Just shadows. And there was this tree in a clearing. It didn't look right. The bark was oozing something, and the air around it felt cold." Jean's expression darkened. He set his coffee down and leaned forward. "Listen to me, Hayes. That tree, that clearing, you don't go back there, ever. Why not?" Ethan asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "What's out there, Jean? What's going on in this park?" Jean hesitated, his gaze drifting to the window. The night outside was pitch black, the forest beyond the glass, an impenetrable void. "This place is old," he said finally. "Older than the park, older than any of us. It doesn't follow the same rules as the rest of the world. There are things out there that don't want to be found." "That's not an answer," Ethan said, his voice rising. "You keep telling me to stay on the trails, to follow the rules, but you won't tell me why. How am I supposed to do my job if I don't know what I'm dealing with?" Jean sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't have all the answers, Hayes. No one does. But I've been here long enough to know this. The forest is alive. It sees you. Hears you. It'll turn to respect it. It'll turn on you. Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. The idea was absurd, impossible, and yet it felt true in a way he couldn't explain. What about the voices? He asked. What are they? Jean shook his head. They're not people, if that's what you're thinking. Whatever you heard, whatever called your name it, wasn't human. Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. He thought of the whispers, the strange cadence of the voices. It had sounded almost human, but not quite. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked. Would you have believed me? Jean countered. Most people don't until they experience it for themselves. Ethan didn't respond. He finished his coffee in silence, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Jean's words had only deepened the mystery, and Ethan wasn't sure how much more of it he could take. That night, the whispers came again. Ethan had just drifted off to sleep when a noise jolted him awake. It wasn't the whispers this time, but something heavier footsteps, moving through the underbrush outside his cabin. He sat up, his heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand. The footsteps stopped as soon as he turned on the light. Ethan swung his legs out of bed, his pulse pounding in his ears. He listened intently, but the night outside was silent, too silent. He crept to the window, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam of light illuminated the clearing outside the cabin, but nothing moved. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Then he saw them two glowing eyes, staring at him from the edge of the tree line. They were pale and luminous, like the reflection of moonlight on water. They blinked once, slowly, and then disappeared into the darkness. Ethan stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. He fumbled for his radio, his hands shaking as he brought it to his mouth. Jean, he whispered. There's something outside. The radio crackled, and Jean's voice came through, calm but firm. Stay inside, Hayes. Don't open the door. Don't go outside. What is it? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause, then Jean said, just stay put. I'll be there in the morning. The radio clicked off, leaving Ethan alone with the silence. He backed away from the window, his flashlight still clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Ethan sat in the center of his cabin, flashlight in hand, his back pressed firmly against the wall. The clock on the shelf ticked loudly, marking the slow crawl of time. Every creak of the wooden floor, every faint groan of the wind outside made his heart jump. He couldn't stop thinking about the glowing eyes in the forest. The rational part of his mind tried to explain it away. An animal, a trick of the light, his own imagination. But deep down, he knew better. Those eyes weren't like anything he'd seen before. They were too intelligent, too deliberate. Whatever had been watching him knew he was there. The hours stretched on, the cabin cloaked in an oppressive silence. He tried the radio again, but Jean didn't respond. A faint static buzzed through the speaker, a sound that felt more like a taunt than a reassurance. Ethan's grip on the flashlight tightened as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The pale rays cut through the gloom, casting long shadows across the room. Only then did he allow himself to breathe a little easier. The forest didn't feel as threatening in the daylight, though the memory of those eyes lingered like a dark stain on his thoughts. When the sun finally rose above the trees, Ethan heard the crunch of gravel outside. He jumped to his feet, relief flooding through him as he saw Jean's familiar figure approaching the cabin. The older ranger carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression grim. "You all right?" Jean asked as he stepped inside, his voice low. "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "There was something outside last night. Eyes, glowing, watching me." "What the hell is out there, Jean?" Jean shut the door behind him and set the rifle against the wall. "You're lucky it didn't come closer," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. Ethan stared at him. "That's it? That's all you have to say? You knew this would happen, didn't you?" Jean sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I told you this place has its rules. You're seeing now what happens when those rules aren't followed." "I didn't break any rules," Ethan snapped. "I stayed on the trail. I didn't answer the whispers. You went off the trail haze," Jean interrupted. "You stepped into that clearing. That's enough." Ethan opened his mouth to argue but stopped. He had gone into the clearing, hadn't he? The memory was hazy, blurred by the fear and confusion of the moment, but he couldn't deny it. "So, what now?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter. Jean crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Now, you learn to listen. The forest isn't going to make this easy for you, but it hasn't taken you yet. That means there's still a chance to make things right. Make things right." Ethan echoed. "How?" "By doing your job," Jean said simply. "Patrol the trails. Keep an eye out for visitors. Stay away from the places that feel wrong. And above all, don't let the forest scare you into making mistakes." Ethan wanted to press for more answers, but the look on Jean's face told him it was useless. The older ranger had already said more than he likely intended, and Ethan wasn't sure he wanted to hear the rest. Ethan spent the rest of the morning patrolling the northern trails, trying to distract himself from the lingering fear that clung to him like a shadow. The forest was calmer during the day, its dangers hidden beneath the surface. Birds chirped overhead, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the sun filtered through the canopy in golden streaks. But even in the daylight, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The sensation was subtle, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Every so often, he would stop and look over his shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. There was never anything there, but the unease remained. Around midday, he reached an observation point overlooking the valley. The view was breathtaking, a sea of green stretching out to the horizon, broken only by the occasional glint of a river or the jagged peaks of distant mountains. Ethan leaned against the wooden railing, letting the beauty of the scene calm his nerves. As he stood there, he noticed something unusual on the ground near the edge of the platform. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked into a cairn, sat at the base of a tree. It wasn't uncommon to find cairns in the park. Hikers often built them to mark trails or commemorate their visits, but this one felt out of place. The rocks were smooth and polished, unlike the rough stones typically found in the area, and the cairn was perfectly balanced, as if placed by a meticulous hand. Ethan crouched down, examining the cairn more closely. There were markings etched into the surface of the stone's thin, jagged lines that didn't look natural. He traced one of the lines with his finger, feeling the grooves beneath his touch. The air around him grew colder, and the forest seemed to fall silent. Ethan straightened, his instincts screaming at him to leave. He backed away from the cairn, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt. "Jean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found something on the north trail, a cairn with markings on the rocks. You ever seen anything like that?" The radio crackled, and Jean's voice came through, tense and clipped. "Leave it alone, Hayes. Don't touch it. Don't stay near it." "I already touched it," Ethan admitted, his heart sinking. There was a long pause on the other end. When Jean finally spoke, his tone was grave. "Then you need to get out of there. Now." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He turned and headed back down the trail, his pace quickening with every step. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing darker despite the midday sun. The feeling of being watched intensified, and Ethan could swear he heard faint whispers trailing behind him. By the time Ethan returned to the station, he was out of breath and drenched in sweat. Jean was waiting for him on the porch, his rifle in hand. "Did you move the rocks?" Jean asked, his eyes narrowing. "No," Ethan said. "I just touched one of them." Jean nodded, his jaw tightening. That's good. You don't want to move them. That's how you invite them in. Them. Ethan asked, his stomach sinking. "Who are they?" Jean didn't answer right away. He looked out at the forest, his expression unreadable. "The forest is full of things we don't understand, Hayes. Spirits, shadows, whatever you want to call them. They've been here long before us, and they don't take kindly to being disturbed." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "So, what do I do now?" "You follow the rules," Jean said firmly. "Stay on the trails. Don't touch anything that doesn't belong to you. And if you see anything or anyone that feels wrong, you turn the other way." Ethan nodded, though the weight of Jean's words pressed heavily on him. He had thought he was prepared for this job, but the more time he spent in Hollow Pines, the more he realized how little he understood. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, staring out at the darkening forest. The whispers hadn't returned, and the glowing eyes were nowhere to be seen. But the stillness of the night felt like a warning, a reminder that the forest was always watching. And it wasn't done with him yet. Ethan woke to the sound of rain pattering against the cabin's roof. The steady rhythm was oddly soothing, masking the eerie silence that usually accompanied his mornings in Hollow Pines. For the first time in days, he felt a brief sense of normalcy. He stretched, his muscles sore from the previous day's patrol, and stared at the ceiling as the events of the past week replayed in his mind. The glowing eyes, the whispers, the can with its strange markings. Each moment felt like a thread unraveling from a larger, incomprehensible tapestry, one he wasn't sure he wanted to see in its entirety. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:13 a.m. It was earlier than he usually started his day, but the restless energy buzzing under his skin wouldn't let him stay in bed. He got dressed, made a quick breakfast of oatmeal and black coffee, and sat at the table, staring at the map Jean had given him. The map was old, its edges frayed and yellowed. It showed every trail, stream, and clearing in the park, marked with meticulous detail. But as Ethan traced the paths with his finger, he noticed something strange. The spiral-patterned clearing he had stumbled upon wasn't on the map. He frowned, flipping the map over to see if anything had been noted on the back. It was blank. He grabbed the notebook Jean had given him, flipping through its pages for any mention of the tearing or the cans. Nothing. Ethan's frustration mounted. How could something so distinct a place, that clearly had significance, be omitted from the park's official records? It didn't make sense. The sound of the radio crackling broke his concentration. He grabbed it quickly, relief flooding through him when he heard Jean's voice. "Hayes, you there?" "I'm here," Ethan replied. "What's up?" "Storms rolling in," Jean said. "Strong one. Stay close to the cabin today. No patrolling." Ethan glanced out the window. The rain had picked up, the wind bending the trees and sending leaves swirling through the air. "Got it," he said. "I'll keep an eye on things from here." "Good," Jean said. And Hayes, if you hear anything strange, stay inside. Don't go looking for it. Ethan sighed. Yeah, I know. Stick to the rules. The radio went silent, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts once more. He looked back at the map, his finger lingering on the blank space where the clearing should have been. By midday, the storm had intensified. The rain pounded against the cabin's roof, and the wind howled like a living thing. Ethan lit a fire in the wood stove, the warmth doing little to chase away the unease that had settled over him. The forest beyond the window was a blur of grey and green, the trees swaying violently in the wind. Ethan tried to keep himself busy. He cleaned his gear, reorganized the cabin's small pantry, and even attempted to read one of the paperback novels left on the shelf. But no matter what he did, his thoughts kept drifting back to the clearing and the cairn. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something, that the forest was trying to tell him something he didn't yet understand. As the afternoon wore on, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Ethan sat by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. The world outside felt distant, almost surreal, like a painting come to life. Then he saw it. Through the sheets of rain, a figure stood at the edge of the tree line. It was hard to make out any details through the downpour, but it was unmistakably human, or at least human-shaped. The figure didn't move, didn't gesture. It simply stood there, watching. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed his binoculars from the table and raised them to his eyes, trying to get a better look. The figure came into focus, and his stomach dropped. It was a man, but his face was obscured by shadows, even though no trees or branches should have been casting them. His clothes were tattered, hanging from his frame as though they didn't quite belong to him. And his eyes, Ethan could barely see them, but they glinted faintly, reflecting the dim light in a way that felt wrong. Ethan lowered the binoculars, his heart pounding. When he looked again, the figure was gone. He sat back, running a hand through his hair. Was it a trick of the rain, his imagination playing games with him? Or was it something else entirely? His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Ethan froze, the sound cutting through the storm like a knife. He stared at the door, his mind racing. Who would be out here in weather like this? And why hadn't Jean mentioned anyone else being in the park? The knock came again, louder this time. Ethan stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He grabbed the flashlight from the table and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaky. There was no response. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it shut, to ignore whatever or whoever was outside. But his curiosity got the better of him. He unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peering out into the storm. The porch was empty. Rain blew in sideways, soaking his shirt as he scanned the area with his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty clearing in front of the cabin. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have knocked. Ethan shut the door quickly, locking it behind him. He leaned against it, his chest heaving as he tried to calm his racing heart. Then he saw the footprint. They were faint but unmistakable, trailing across the porch and disappearing into the mud beyond. Ethan stared at them, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The prints were human barefoot, by the look of them, but they were too large, the toes elongated and splayed in a way that didn't seem natural. He grabbed the radio, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the controls. "Jean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something outside my cabin." The static on the other end was deafening. Ethan adjusted the frequency, trying to cut through the noise, but the signal remained garbled. He cursed under his breath, slamming the radio down on the table. The knock came again, louder this time. as though the person or thing outside was losing patience. Ethan backed away from the door, his eyes darting to the rifle Jean had left him. He grabbed it, the weight of the weapon reassuring in his hands. "Whoever's out there, you'd better leave," he shouted, his voice trembling. "I'm armed." The knocking stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind and the rain hammering against the cabin. Then, from somewhere outside, Ethan heard a voice. "Ethan," it called, soft and melodic, almost like a song. "Come outside." Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. "No," he said, his voice barely audible. "You're not real." The voice came again, closer this time. "Ethan, it's safe. Come outside." The sound was wrong. It was his name, but it wasn't. The way it was spoken, the inflection, was as if someone had heard it for the first time and was trying to mimic how it should sound. Ethan backed into the corner of the room, the rifle held tightly against his chest. The voice continued, calling his name over and over, each repetition more distorted than the last. It echoed inside his head, filling every corner of his mind, until he thought he might scream. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Ethan sat there trembling, the rifle still clutched in his hands. He didn't move until the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting the cabin in a pale, watery glow. The rain had stopped by the time Ethan stepped out of the cabin. The morning air was damp and heavy, clinging to his clothes as he surveyed the clearing. The footprints were still their deep impressions in the mud, their strange, elongated shapes unmistakable. He crouched down, studying them in the soft light of dawn. The prints led from the forest's edge to his porch and then back again, as if whatever had been outside had waited there for a while before retreating. The thought made his stomach turn. Ethan straightened, gripping the rifle Jean had given him. He'd barely slept the night before, his nerves frayed from the persistent knocking and the disembodied voice. The storm had hidden the forest in shadows, but now, in the daylight, everything felt exposed, vulnerable. The radio on his belt crackled to life, making him jump. He fumbled for it, his fingers shaking as he pressed the button. "Yeah?" he said, his voice rough from lack of sleep. "Hayes, it's Jean," came the reply. Storms cleared. "I need you to check the South Trail today. There's been a report of downed trees, maybe a landslide." Ethan hesitated. "Jean, I need to talk to you about..." "We'll talk later," Jean interrupted, his tone clipped. "Just take care of the South Trail for now, and remember the rules." The line went dead before Ethan could respond. He cursed under his breath, shoving the radio back onto his belt. The rules. Always the rule. He'd followed them as best he could, but the forest didn't seem to care. The South Trail was one of the more remote paths in hollow pines, winding through dense woods and steep ridges before leveling out near the river. The hike there was grueling, but Ethan welcomed the distraction. The rhythmic crunch of his boots against the dirt, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, these small, familiar sounds helped settle his nerves. But as he descended into the valley, the forest began to change. The first thing he noticed was the smell. A faint, metallic tang hung in the air, sharp and unnatural. It reminded him of rusted metal or old blood, and it grew stronger the further he went. The trees, too, seemed different. Their trunks were darker, their branches more gnarled, twisting into shapes that resembled grasping hands. Even the light filtering through the canopy felt wrong, dim and murky despite the clear sky above. Ethan stopped at a bend in the trail, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But Jean's voice echoed in his mind. Stick to the trails. Do your job. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pressed on. He found the landslide about 2 miles in. A section of the trail had been completely buried under a mound of dirt, rocks, and uprooted trees. The destruction was fresh, the soil was still damp, and the scent of torn wood hung heavy in the air. Ethan radioed Jean to report the damage, but the signal was weak, and his words came through garbled. Frustrated, he gave up and began marking the area on his map. He'd have to return later with better equipment to clear the path. As he worked, a faint sound reached his ears. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. A hum, low and resonant, seemed to emanate from the forest itself. It wasn't the one. Ethan was sure of that. The sound had a rhythm to it, like a chant spoken in a language he didn't understand. He turned slowly, scanning the trees. The forest was unnaturally still, the usual rustle of leaves and chirping birds absent. The hum continued, growing louder, more insistent. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, through his chest, filling him with a sense of dread. Then he saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, their forms shrouded in shadow. They moved unnaturally, their limbs jerking as though they were marionettes controlled by an unseen hand. Their faces were indistinct, blurred, as if the forest itself refused to reveal their true features. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He gripped the rifle tightly, his knuckles white. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice echoing through the valley. The figures didn't stop. They advanced slowly, deliberately, their movements synchronized with the hum. Ethan backed away, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised the rifle, aiming at the closest figure. "I said stay back," he yelled again, his voice cracking. The figure paused, tilting its head as though furious. The others stopped as well, their blurred faces turning toward Ethan in unison. For a moment, the hum ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Then, the whispers began. Ethan stumbled, his back hitting a tree as the voices filled his head. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, their tones urgent, almost pleading. He clutched his head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices were inside him, echoing through his mind like 1,000 overlapping thoughts. "Leave," one voice finally said, clear and sharp amid the cacophony. "This is not your place." Ethan looked up, his vision swimming. The figures were closer now, their blurred faces mere feet from his own. He scrambled to his feet, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the rifle. He didn't fire. It felt pointless, like the bullets would pass through them without effect. Instead, he turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around him as he fled, the trees twisting and contorting as though trying to trap him. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic. Ethan's lungs burned, his legs threatening to give out, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. When he finally burst onto the main trail, the forest fell silent. The whispers, the hum, the figures, it was all gone. Ethan collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His hands were scraped and bleeding, his clothes torn from the branches that had clawed at him during his escape. He sat there for what felt like hours, his mind racing. He thought of Jean, of the rules, of the forest, and its impossible, unknowable nature. He thought of the voice that had spoken to him, warning him to leave. When he finally stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, he knew one thing for certain. Hollow Pines was no ordinary park, and whatever was out there, it didn't want him here. Ethan returned to the station as the sun was setting, his exhaustion so profound that he barely registered Jean's concerned expression as he stumbled inside. The older ranger didn't ask questions. He simply handed Ethan a cup of coffee and motioned for him to sit. "Rough day?" Jean asked, his tone carefully neutral. "You could say that," Ethan muttered, his hand shaking as he raised the mug to his lips. He recounted what had happened on the South Trail, his words tumbling out in a rush. He told Jean about the hum, the figures, the whispers, everything. Jean listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When Ethan finished, the older man leaned back in his chair, letting out a long sigh. "I told you this place has its rules," Jean said. "The forest doesn't take kindly to people who break them." "I didn't break any rules," Ethan snapped, slamming the mug down on the table. "I was doing my job." Jean held up a hand, his gaze steady. "I'm not blaming you, Hayes. The forest doesn't always play fair. Sometimes it tests you, even when you're following the rules." Ethan shook his head, frustration bubbling over. "So what am I supposed to do? Just let this happen? Pretend it's normal? You survive," Jean said simply. "You keep your head down, you do your job, and you don't let the forest win." The words offered little comfort, but Ethan nodded nonetheless. He didn't have the energy to argue. That night, as he lay in bed, the whispers returned. They were faint, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but they were there, a constant reminder that the forest was watching. And it wasn't done with him yet. Ethan awoke to a dull ache in his shoulders and the lingering remnants of a restless night. The whispers had faded with the dawn, but their presence clung to him like a second skin. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside made his nerves fray a little further. The coffee tasted bitter that morning, no matter how much sugar he added. He drank it anyway, the warmth a small comfort against the unease settling in his chest. Jean had warned him, time and time again, about the forest's rules. But what good were rules when the forest didn't play fair? Ethan spent the morning checking and rechecking his gear. His rifle was clean and loaded, his flashlight batteries replaced. The map Jean had given him sat folded neatly on the table, the edges now worn from constant handling. He studied it again, his eyes tracing the lines of the trails, searching for something he might have missed. His gaze lingered on the southern section of the park, near the landslide he'd encountered the day before. The memory of the figure's blurry and unnatural sent a shiver down his spine. They had been so close, their presence as real as the rifle in his hands. Yet there was no explanation, no logic to what he had seen. Ethan closed the map with a frustrated sigh. Whatever the forest was hiding, it wasn't going to reveal itself willingly. By midday, Ethan was back on the trails. The northern paths were quiet, the air crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The calm was a welcome change from the oppressive atmosphere of the southern woods, but it did little to ease his mind. As he walked, he noticed subtle changes in the environment. The trees here seemed taller, their branches reaching skyward like cathedral spires. Moss covered the ground in thick carpets, and small streams trickled through the underbrush, their water clear and cold. It was beautiful, almost serene, but even in the beauty, there was a sense of wrongness. The forest felt too quiet, as though it were holding its breath. Ethan's footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing in the stillness. He gripped the rifle tighter, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. It was near the base of a ridge that he found the trail. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a game trail, a narrow path winding through the underbrush. But as Ethan approached, he realized it was more deliberate. The ground was packed firm, as though it had been traveled many times, and small marker stones piled neatly, sticks arranged in patterns lined its edges. He knelt to examine one of the markers. The stones were smooth, their surfaces etched with the same strange markings he had seen on the cairn near the observation point. His fingers brushed over the grooves, and a familiar chill crept over him. Ethan stood, his heart pounding. The trail wasn't marked on his map, but it was clearly significant. Against his better judgment, he decided to follow it. The trail led him deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser with each step. The light filtering through the canopy took on an eerie quality, shifting between golden and green hues. Ethan kept his rifle at the ready, his senses on high alert. The markers grew more frequent as he walked. Each one was slightly different, the patterns on the stones forming shapes and symbols that seemed almost purposeful. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and every so often he would spin around, expecting to see someone or something behind him. But the trail remained empty. After nearly an hour of walking, the forest opened into a clearing. The sight took Ethan's breath away. At the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted like the muscles of an ancient giant. Its branches stretched out in all directions, their tips curling like claws. The bark was dark and glistening, as though coated in a thin layer of sap. Around the base of the tree were dozens of cairns, their stones arranged in intricate patterns that radiated outward like the spokes of a wheel. Ethan approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The air here was colder, and the faint hum he had heard the day before was back, vibrating through the ground and into his chest. He stopped a few feet from the nearest cairn, his eyes fixed on the tree. It felt alive in a way that went beyond biology, as though it were aware of his presence. The hum grew louder, and Ethan's head began to ache, a sharp pressure building behind his eyes. He dropped to one knee, clutching his head as the whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Go back. Stay. Listen. The words were fragmented, their meanings conflicting. Ethan pressed his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to block out the sound. The whispers weren't external, they were inside him, worming their way into his mind. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Leave me alone." The whispers ceased abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Ethan staggered to his feet, his vision swimming. The tree loomed before him, its dark bark shimmering in the strange light. And then he saw it. Carved into the trunk of the tree, just below eye level, was a symbol. It was simple, but unmistakable. A spiral, etched deep into the wood. The grooves were dark and glistening, as though the tree itself were bleeding. Ethan reached out instinctively, his fingers hovering over the spiral. The air around it felt electric, vibrating with an energy that made his skin tingle. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something drew him closer. The moment his fingers touched the spiral, a wave of sensation crashed over him. It wasn't pain, exactly, but a deep, overwhelming pressure, like being submerged in water. Images flooded his mind, flashes of faces, places, moments that weren't his. A woman standing in a field, her face streaked with tears. A fire consuming a village. Shadows moving through the forest, their forms shifting and indistinct. And always the spiral. It appeared in every image, etched into stones, drawn on walls, burned into flesh. It was everywhere, a constant, unyielding presence. Ethan pulled his hand back, gasping for air. The tree seemed to pulse, its bark rippling like the surface of a pond. The hum grew louder, filling his head with its relentless vibration. He stumbled back, his legs barely supporting him. The cairns seemed to shift and move, their patterns changing as he watched. The forest around him felt alive, its branches reaching toward him like claws. Ethan turned and ran. He didn't stop until he reached the main trail. His lungs burned, and his legs threatened to give out, but he didn't dare slow down. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows darker, the air heavier. The whispers followed him, faint but persistent, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. When he finally burst onto the gravel path near the ranger station, he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. His hands were scraped and bleeding, his clothes damp with sweat. The rifle hung limply from his shoulder, forgotten in his panic. Jean was waiting for him on the porch, his expression grim. He didn't ask questions, didn't chastise Ethan for leaving the trail. He simply helped him to his feet and guided him inside. That night, Ethan sat in the cabin, staring at the spiral he had drawn in his notebook. The image was burned into his mind, its presence inescapable. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. The forest was trying to tell him something, and he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. The image of the spiral haunted Ethan for the rest of the night. It wasn't just the way it looked etched deep into the bark of the ancient tree, bleeding with an otherworldly sheen, but what it represented. He didn't fully understand its meaning, but he could feel it, like a weight pressing against his mind. He sat at the cabin's small table, his hands trembling as he stared at the rough sketch he'd made in his notebook. The lines were simple, looping inward in perfect symmetry, but there was an energy to them, a sense of movement even though the drawing was still. Every time Ethan tried to look away, his eyes were drawn back to it, as if the spiral itself were pulling him in. The radio crackled to life, snapping Ethan out of his trance. He grabbed it quickly, relief flooding through him at the sound of Jean's voice. "Hayes," Jean said, his tone gruff. "You awake?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yeah, I'm here." "Good," Jean said. "Meet me at the station. We need to talk." Ethan hesitated. Jean's voice carried an urgency that made his stomach twist. "About what?" he asked. "Just get here," Jean said, "and bring that notebook of yours." The line went dead, leaving Ethan with a knot of unease in his chest. He shoved the notebook into his bag, grabbed his jacket, and headed out into the crisp night air. The ranger station was dimly lit, its single porch light casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Ethan approached cautiously, the sound of his boots crunching against the ground unnaturally loud in the stillness. Jean was waiting for him inside, seated at the desk with a mug of coffee in hand. His rifle leaned against the wall behind him, a silent testament to the seriousness of the situation. "Sit," Jean said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Ethan obeyed, setting his bag on the floor and pulling out the notebook. He slid it across the desk, the spiral sketch open to the page. Jean stared at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Jean said finally, his voice low. "The tree," Ethan replied, "in the clearing. It had this carved into it." Jean nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "That tree's been there longer than this park has. Longer than this town. Maybe longer than anything else in this forest." "What is it?" Ethan asked. "What does it mean?" Jean let out a long sigh, his eyes drifting to the window. "It's a marker," he said. "A boundary. That spiral shows up in all the places you're not supposed to go. Places where the forest doesn't follow the rules. Ethan frowned, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? You knew something was out here, and you just let me walk into it blind. You think I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes? Gene snapped, his voice rising. You think I haven't been out there, seen the things you've seen? I've lost people in this park, Hayes. Good people who thought they could handle it. If I gave you all the answers, you'd have gone looking for trouble on your first day. I'm already in trouble. Ethan shot back, his voice shaking. Whatever's out there, it's not going to let me walk away, is it? Gene's silence was answer enough. They sat in tense silence for a while, the hum of the station's fluorescent lights filling the space between them. Finally, Gene spoke again, his voice quieter this time. You've got two choices, Hayes, he said. You can leave. Pack up your things and never look back. The forest might let you go if you leave now. And the other choice? Ethan asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. Gene's gaze was steady. You stay. You do your job. And you learn to live with the things you've seen. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. The thought of leaving was tempting more, tempting than he wanted to admit. But something about the forest wouldn't let him go. Not yet. There was a pull, a gravity to it that he couldn't ignore. I'll stay, he said finally, the words heavy on his tongue. But I need to know what I'm dealing with. Gene nodded, as though he'd expected that answer. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old, leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, and the pages inside were filled with faded handwriting. This belonged to the ranger who trained me, Gene said, sliding the journal across the desk. And the ranger who trained him before that. It's been passed down for decades. Everything we know about this place, everything we've learned, it's in there. Ethan hesitated before picking up the journal. The leather felt cool and smooth under his fingers, the weight of it strangely comforting. He opened it to the first page, his eyes scanning the neat, looping handwriting. Journal of Samuel Cartwright, head ranger of Hollow Pines, 1947-1962. The forest is alive. That was the first sentence, written in bold, deliberate strokes. The rest of the page detailed Samuel Cartwright's first encounter with the spiral, describing a clearing much like the one Ethan had found. Cartwright had seen the symbols carved into trees, stones, even the bodies of animals. He had heard the whispers, felt the hum. He had known, even then, that the forest was something more than it seemed. As Ethan flipped through the pages, he found more entries, some written in calm, measured tones, others frantic and nearly illegible. They spoke of disappearances, sightings of shadowy figures, and strange phenomena that defied explanation. One passage stood out in particular. The spiral marks a threshold. Beyond it lies a place where time and reason hold no sway. Those who cross it are never the same. Some return hollow, their eyes empty and their minds shattered. Others do not return at all. Ethan closed the journal, his hands trembling. He looked up at Gene, his chest tight with unspoken questions. You've been there, haven't you? He asked. Beyond the spiral. Gene didn't answer right away. He stared at the notebook on the desk, his expression distant. Once, he said finally. I barely made it back. What did you see? Ethan pressed. Gene's jaw tightened. Things I can't explain. Things I don't want to explain. But I'll tell you this. Whatever's out there, it's older than us. Older than this park, this town, this whole damn country. And it doesn't like being disturbed. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind racing. He thought of the cairns, the figures in the woods, the hum that had vibrated through his very bones. He thought of the spiral, etched into the ancient tree like a warning or an invitation. "What happens if I don't go back?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jean's gaze was sharp, piercing. "The forest won't forget you, Hayes. If you stay on the trails, stick to the rules, and keep your head down, it might leave you alone. But if you go looking for answers, well, don't expect them to come without a cost." That night, Ethan returned to his cabin with the journal tucked under his arm. He spent hours reading by the light of the fire, his mind absorbing the words of rangers long gone. Each page brought new insights, new fears. The forest wasn't just a live, it was sentient. It had moods, desires, and boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequence. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. The forest had marked him, just as it had marked those who came before him. There was no escaping it now. All he could do was survive. And yet, the part of him couldn't let go of the questions. Why had the spiral appeared to him? What did the forest want? And what lay beyond the boundary it marked? The whispers returned as he drifted off to sleep, faint and melodic, like a distant song carried on the wind. "Ethan," they called, soft and insistent. "Come back." The radio crackled to life late in the afternoon. Ethan nearly dropped his coffee as Jean's voice cut through the static. "Hayes, you there?" "Yeah," Ethan replied, fumbling for the radio. "What's up?" "There's been a report of smoke near Raven's Hollow," Jean said. "Could be a campfire, could be something worse. I need you to check it out." Ethan hesitated. Raven's Hollow was one of the most remote sections of the park, a place few visitors ever ventured. It was also near the edge of the area marked with spirals on his map. "Can't we both go?" Ethan asked, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "I've got my hands full over here," June said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You'll be fine. Just follow the rules. The rules. Always the rules." Ethan sighed, grabbing his pack and rifle. I'm on it," he said, clipping the radio to his belt. The hike to Raven's Hollow took longer than Ethan expected. The trail was narrow and winding, cutting through dense forest that seemed to grow darker with each passing hour. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a muted green haze. By the time he reached the hollow, the sky was tinged with the orange hues of dusk. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint metallic scent that set Ethan's teeth on edge. He scanned the area carefully, his eyes darting between the trees. Then he saw it, a thin column of smoke rising above the treetops. Ethan approached cautiously, his footsteps soft against the mossy ground. The smoke led him to a small clearing, where a fire burned low in a circle of stones. Beside it sat a man, hunched over with his back to Ethan. His clothes were tattered, his hair wild and unkempt. "Hey," Ethan called out, gripping the rifle tightly. "This is a protected area. You can't camp here." The man didn't respond. Ethan took a few steps closer, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. "Sir, you need." The man turned, and Ethan's words died in his throat. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbone. His eyes were sunken and hollow, but they gleamed with an unnatural light, like the glow of distant stars. His lips moved, but no sound came out, only the faint hum Ethan had heard in the clearing with the spiral. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to something behind Ethan. Ethan spun around, his pulse racing. The forest was still, the shadows deep and impenetrable. But there, carved into the trunk of a massive tree, was another spiral. It was identical to the one on the ancient tree he had touched, its lines etched deep into the bark. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting the light like a heat mirage. The hum grew louder, vibrating through Ethan's chest. When he turned back, the man was gone. Ethan stumbled back onto the trail, his mind racing. The spiral, the man, the hummet, all felt connected, pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet see. He radioed Jean as he walked, his voice unsteady. "I found a fire at Raven's Hollow," he said. "And a man. He disappeared." Jean's reply was immediate. "Get out of their haze. Now." "I already left," Ethan said. "But there's something else. Another spiral. It's on a tree near the clearing." Jean's silence was telling. When he finally spoke, his tone was grim. "You didn't touch it, did you?" "No," Ethan said, "but the air around it, it felt strange, like it was alive." Jean swore under his breath. "Head back to the station. We'll talk there." Ethan reached the station just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Jean was waiting for him on the porch, a stormy look on his face. He motioned for Ethan to sit, then handed him a mug of coffee. It had become their unspoken ritual in times of crisis. "You're seeing more than most do," Jean said, breaking the silence. "The spirals, the hum, that man. It's all tied to this place, to what it is. And what is it?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "What's happening out there?" Jean took a long sip of coffee, his gaze distant. "The forest doesn't just exist in one place, Hayes. It's connected to something bigger, something older. The spirals mark the points where the barriers are thinnest." "Barriers?" Ethan asked, frowning. "Between worlds," Jean said simply. "Between here and wherever those things come from." Ethan stared at him, his stomach churning. "You're telling me this forest is some kind of gateway?" "Not just this forest," Jean said, "but Hollow Pines has more of them than most. The spirals are warnings, markers left by whatever came before us. They're telling us to stay out." "And if we don't?" Ethan asked. Jean's expression darkened. "Then the forest takes you." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, the journal open on his chest, its pages filled with fragmented accounts of disappearances and strange encounters. The words blurred together as exhaustion set in, but his mind refused to rest. Around midnight, the whispers returned. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more insistent. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding as he scanned the room. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls like a disembodied chorus. "Ethan," they called, soft and melodic. "Come back." He grabbed the rifle from beside the bed, his hands trembling. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice breaking. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, their tones overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Ethan clutched his head, his knees buckling as the voices filled his mind. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. Ethan looked around, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was still, the only sound the crackling of the dying fire in the stove. But when he glanced at the window, his blood ran cold. There, pressed against the glass, was the faint outline of a hand. Ethan stared at the handprint on the window, his breath caught in his throat. The outline was faint but unmistakable, its size larger than any human hand he had ever seen. The fingers were long and thin, tipped with claw-like points that pressed into the glass as though trying to pierce it. The sight sent a jolt of fear through him, paralyzing him in place. For a moment, he could only watch, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, as if sensing his gaze, the hand slid away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the window. The faint smudge it left behind glistened in the firelight, like the residue of oil or sap. Ethan scrambled for the radio on his nightstand, his fingers trembling as he pressed the button. "Jean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something outside my cabin." The static that replied seemed louder than usual, grating against his already frayed nerves. "Stay inside," Jean's voice crackled through. "Lock the doors. Don't look out the windows." Ethan wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but his fear left him mute. He dropped the radio, grabbed his rifle, and bolted the cabin door. He slid a chair under the knob for good measure, his mind racing. What had it been? One of the shadowy figures, or something worse? The whispers returned as he sat in the corner of the room, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. They were faint at first, brushing against the edges of his consciousness like the memory of a voice. But as the minutes dragged on, they grew louder, clearer. "Ethan," they called, their tones melodic and almost kind. "Come to us." Ethan pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block them out, but the whispers weren't coming from outside. They were inside him, threading through his mind like vines. The whispers stopped suddenly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Ethan lowered his hands, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breathing. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. And then he heard Itae's single knock at the door. The sound was deliberate, measured, not the frantic pounding of someone seeking help, but a calm, purposeful knock that made Ethan's skin crawl. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Ethan stood slowly, his grip tightening on the rifle. He took a step toward the door, his heart hammering in his chest. "Leave me alone," he yelled, his voice trembling with fear. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. For a moment, Ethan thought the thing outside had gone. Then came the sound of footsteps circling the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel and dirt with each step. Ethan turned, following the sound as it moved from one window to the next. He raised the rifle, his finger hovering over the trigger, though he wasn't sure what good it would do. The footsteps stopped at the back of the cabin, near the small kitchen window. Ethan held his breath, waiting for whatever was outside to make its next move. But instead of another knock or a voice, there came a low, guttural growl. The sound was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard, deep and resonant, like the rumble of an earthquake. It sent a shiver down his spine, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The growl grew louder, vibrating through the cabin walls. Then, with a sudden crash, the kitchen window shattered, sending shards of glass raining onto the floor. Ethan stumbled back, his rifle raised as he aimed at the now empty window frame. The growl had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. He strained to see through the darkness outside, his breath fogging in the cold air. And then it stepped into view. The thing that emerged from the shadows wasn't human at least. Not anymore. It stood hunched, its elongated limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural grace. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, and its face was a mask of shifting shadows. But its eyes, those were the worst of all. They glowed faintly, reflecting the dim firelight like twin orbs of liquid silver. Ethan froze, his finger hovering over the trigger. The thing tilted its head, its gaze locking onto him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. It took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, almost curious. "Stay back," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "I'll shoot." The thing didn't respond. It took another step forward, its claws scraping against the wooden floor. Ethan's hands trembled as he adjusted his aim, his mind racing. He didn't want to fear a knot because he thought it would miss, but because he wasn't sure what would happen if it hit. The thing stopped a few feet from him, its head tilting again. For a moment, Ethan thought it might leave, that it had decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Then it spoke. "Ethan," it rasped, its voice low and guttural, as though the effort of forming the word was almost too much. "Come with me." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The thing's voice was familiar, its cadence and tone eerily similar to his own. "I'm not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice firmer now. "Get out." The thing let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "You are already ours." It lunged. The gunshot echoed through the cabin, deafening in the small space. The thing recoiled, a dark, viscous liquid seeping from the wound in its chest. It let out a guttural scream, the sound so loud and piercing that Ethan dropped the rifle, his hands flying to his ears. The thing staggered back, its movements jerky and disjointed. It stared at Ethan for a long moment, its glowing eyes filled with something that might have been hatred or pity. Then it turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness beyond the shattered window. Ethan stood there, his chest heaving, his ears ringing from the gunshot. The room was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the faint rustle of the wind outside. He felt a pang of guilt as he looked at the broken window, the floor littered with shards of glass and dark stains. But the guilt was quickly replaced by something else, relief. Whatever the thing had been, it was gone, for now. The next morning, Gene arrived at the cabin, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. Ethan recounted everything: the handprint on the window, the whispers, the creature that had spoken his name. Gene listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word. "You shouldn't have fired," Gene said when Ethan was finished. "The forest doesn't take kindly to violence." "What was I supposed to do?" Ethan snapped. "Let it take me?" Gene didn't respond. Instead, he picked up the journal from the table, flipping through its pages until he found what he was looking for. He turned the book toward Ethan, pointing to a passage written in shaky, uneven handwriting. "They are the keepers of the threshold," it read, "guardians of the boundary. To harm them is to invite the wrath of the forest." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "You think it's going to come back?" Gene's expression was unreadable. "I don't know, but you've marked yourself now. The forest won't forget." Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. He thought of the spirals, the hum, the whispers that had invaded his mind. He thought of the creature that had spoken his name, its voice so familiar yet so alien. "What do I do?" he asked finally. Gene sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You survive," he said, "and you hope that's enough." The forest was silent, unnervingly so. Even in the early hours of the morning, when the park should have been stirring with life, hollow pines lay still. The usual sounds of birdsong, rustling leaves, and distant streams had vanished. leaving only the oppressive quiet that now filled every corner of Ethan's world. Jean left the cabin without another word, his expression grim, as he stepped into the shadows of the trees. Ethan watched him go, his mind racing. The older ranger had always seemed unshakable, a man who had seen everything the forest could throw at him. But after last night's events, there was something new in Jean's eyes: fear. Ethan sat at the table, staring at the journal spread open before him. The passage Jean had shown him, the warning about the forest's keepers, looped in his mind, its meaning sinking deeper with every repetition. To harm them is to invite the wrath of the forest. He flipped through the pages, searching for answers. The journal was filled with accounts of strange encounters and cryptic warnings, but none of them offered a clear path forward. Instead, the entries painted a picture of a place that was both ancient and alive, a force that punished those who dared to challenge its balance. Ethan's gaze shifted to his notebook, the spiral he had sketched staring back at him. The simple lines seemed to pulse with an energy he couldn't ignore, drawing his thoughts back to the clearing, the cairns, and the ancient tree. The forest wanted something from him. That much was clear. But what and why him? As the morning light deepened, Ethan forced himself to leave the cabin. Staying inside felt safe, but it also felt like hiding, and hiding wouldn't get him any closer to understanding the forest's secrets. He slung his pack over his shoulder, grabbed his rifle, and headed for the trails. The forest greeted him with its usual eerie stillness. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, but there was an edge to it, a tension that prickled against his skin. Every step felt like an intrusion, the crunch of leaves underfoot echoing too loudly in the quiet. Ethan followed the northern trail, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The memory of the creature from the night before lingered in his mind. Its glowing eyes and rasping voice seared into his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching him, waiting. He came across a marker near a bend in the trail, a small pile of stones, carefully arranged. Ethan crouched down, examining it closely. The stones were smooth and polished, their surfaces etched with the same strange markings he had seen before. But this time, there was something new, a faint streak of dark liquid, dried and flaking, trailing across the topmost stone. Ethan's stomach churned. He touched the streak cautiously, rubbing the flakes between his fingers. It wasn't sap. It was something else, something that felt wrong. He stood quickly, his pulse racing as he scanned the forest around him. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But the tension in the air was palpable. He should have turned back then, but something pushed him forward, an unseen force drawing him deeper into the woods. The trail led Ethan to a part of the park he hadn't explored before, a dense grove where the trees grew so close together that their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The air here was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that set his nerves on edge. At the center of the grove stood another cairn, this one larger than the others he had seen. The stones were stacked high, forming a pyramid that reached almost to Ethan's chest. They were covered in markings, their grooves deep and deliberate, and the spiral was etched into the larger stone at the top. Ethan approached cautiously, his rifle at the ready. The air around the cairn felt thick, almost viscous, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the spiral. "Don't." The voice came from behind him, sharp and commanding. Ethan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Jean stood at the edge of the grove, his expression dark. "What are you doing here?" Jean demanded, stepping closer. I told you to stay on the trails. I was following a marker, Ethan said, his voice defensive. It led me here. Jean's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the cairn. This isn't a place you should be. Why not? Ethan asked. What's so dangerous about a pile of rocks? It's not the rocks that are dangerous, Jean said. It's what they're holding back. Ethan frowned, glancing at the cairn. What do you mean? Jean sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The cairns aren't just markers, Hayes. They're seals. They're meant to keep things in, to keep the forest balanced. And the spirals, Ethan pressed. What do they mean? They're part of the seal, Jean said. A warning to stay away, to let sleeping things lie. Ethan's gaze shifted back to the cairn. The spiral seemed to shimmer faintly, its lines almost glowing in the dim light. What happens if the seal is broken? He asked. Jean didn't answer. His silence was enough. They walked back to the station in uneasy silence, the weight of the forest pressing down on them. Jean's mood was darker than usual, his movements stiff and tense. Ethan could tell he was holding something back, but he didn't press him. Not yet. When they reached the station, Jean motioned for Ethan to sit. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of Ethan before taking the chair across from him. You need to understand something, Hayes, Jean said, his voice low. This park, it's not like other places. It's older than we are, older than this town, this country, and it remembers everything. Remembers? Ethan asked, frowning. Jean nodded. Every step we take, every word we speak, it leaves an impression. The forest sees us, hears us, and if we're not careful, it reacts. Reacts how? Ethan asked, his voice tinged with frustration. What does it want from us? Jean leaned forward, his gaze intense. It wants balance, and it will do whatever it takes to maintain that balance. Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. He thought of the cairns, the spirals, the strange markings etched into the stones. He thought of the creature that had spoken his name, its voice a mockery of his own. What happens if I don't leave? Ethan asked finally. Jean's expression softened, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Then you become part of the forest, he said, one way or another. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, the journal open on his lap. He read until his eyes burned, searching for anything that might help him make sense of what was happening. The entries were fragmented, their meanings obscured by time and fear, but one phrase stood out: the marked ones cannot escape. The forest claims them in the end. Ethan closed the journal, his hands shaking. He thought of the spiral etched into the tree, the cairns standing silent and watchful in the woods. He thought of the whispers that had followed him, the creature that had spoken his name, and he thought of the mark on his chest, the faint scar that had appeared after he touched the spiral in the clearing. The forest had claimed him, whether he liked it or not, and now there was no turning back. Ethan woke to the sound of wind rattling the cabin's windows. The morning light filtered through the curtains, weak and pale, casting the room in an eerie glow. For a brief moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. The spirals, the cairns, the creature with glowing eyes. But the faint scar on his chest, barely visible in the mirror, told him otherwise. He sat on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his hair as the events of the past week weighed on him. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something alive, something aware, and it had marked him. The thought made his stomach churn. Ethan spent the morning at the ranger station, organizing supplies and restocking his pack. Jean had left a note on the desk, scrawled in his usual sharp handwriting. "Stay on the trails. Don't go alone." The simplicity of the message irritated Ethan. Jean always seemed to have more answers than he was willing to share. By noon, the cabin felt suffocating. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Ethan grabbed his gear and headed outside, hoping the open space of the forest would clear his mind. But as soon as he stepped onto the porch, he felt it, that subtle, almost imperceptible pull. It was the same feeling that had drawn him to the cairns, to the spirals. The forest was calling him. Ethan didn't bother with the main trails. He followed the pool instead, letting it guide his steps. The trees seemed to part for him, their branches swaying in an unseen breeze. The air grew cooler, carrying with it the faint metallic tang that had become all too familiar. It wasn't long before he found himself in another unfamiliar part of the park. The trees here were taller, their trunks darker and twisted, as if shaped by some unseen force. The ground was covered in moss, soft and spongy underfoot, and small streams carved intricate paths through the underbrush. At the center of the grove stood another cairn, smaller than the others, but no less significant. The stones were arranged in a spiral pattern, their surfaces smooth and polished. Ethan approached cautiously, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The air around the cairn felt heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. He knelt down, examining the markings on the stones. They were similar to the ones he had seen before, but these were more intricate, their lines forming symbols he didn't recognize. "Why are you showing me that?" Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The forest didn't answer, but the pull grew stronger, more insistent. Ethan stood, his heart racing as he followed it deeper into the woods. The pull led him to a clearing, its edges lined with ancient trees whose branches intertwined overhead, forming a natural archway. In the center of the clearing stood a monolith, towering slab of stone, its surface etched with spirals and symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Ethan approached slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The monolith pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. The air around it was cold, almost icy, and the faint hum he had heard before was back, vibrating through his chest. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the surface of the stone. The glow intensified, the symbols shifting and twisting as though alive. Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but the pull was too strong. The moment his fingers touched the stone, the world shifted. Ethan was no longer in the clearing. He stood in a vast, endless forest, the trees stretching upward into a sky that pulsed with colors he couldn't name. The air was thick with mist, and the ground beneath his feet felt strange, like it wasn't entirely solid. The hum was everywhere now, resonating through his body like a second heartbeat. Shadows moved between the trees, their forms indistinct and fluid. Ethan couldn't tell if they were watching him or merely passing through, but their presence was undeniable. He took a cautious step forward, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, mossy ground. The air was cool, carrying a faint, sweet scent that made his head swim. He felt weightless, as though the forest itself were holding him up. "Ethan," the whispers came, clearer now. "You've come." The voice was soft, almost kind, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He turned, searching for the source, but the forest remained empty. "What do you want from me?" Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the strange, dreamlike space. "To listen," the voice replied. "To see." The ground beneath Ethan's feet shifted, and he stumbled, catching himself against a nearby tree. The bark was smooth and cold, and as he touched it, images flooded his mind. He saw the spirals, etched into stone and wood, their lines glowing with an ancient light. He saw the cairns, their patterns forming intricate maps that seemed to shift and change. And he saw the kippas, the shadowy figures that moved through the forest, their forms flickering like flames. "Why me?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Because you are marked," the voice said. "You are chosen." Ethan felt a surge of anger, his fear giving way to frustration. "I didn't choose this," he shouted. "I don't want this." The forest seemed to shudder, the hum growing louder. The shadows between the trees drew closer, their forms coalescing into something more solid. Ethan backed away, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. "You cannot run," the voice said, its tone gentle but firm. "You are bound to this place." Ethan wasn't sure how long he wandered through the strange forest. Time felt meaningless here, the sky above shifting between light and darkness without warning. The shadows followed him, always just out of reach, their presence a constant reminder that he was not alone. He came across another monolith, smaller than the first but no less imposing. Its surface was covered in spirals and symbols, the glow brighter now, almost blinding. Ethan approached cautiously, the hum vibrating through his bones. The whispers returned, soft and melodic. "Ethan, listen." He reached out, his fingers brushing against the surface of the stone. The glow enveloped him, the symbols shifting and swirling as though alive. The hum grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Ethan opened his eyes to find himself back in the clearing. The monolith was gone, replaced by the familiar trees of hollow pines. The air was still, the forest silent, but something had changed. Ethan looked down at his hands, his breath catching in his throat. The markings from the monolith were etched into his skin, faint but unmistakable. They pulsed with a soft light, the spirals and symbols glowing faintly in the dim forest light. He sank to his knees, his mind racing. The forest had marked him, claimed him in a way he didn't fully understand. There was no going back now. The forest had made its choice. The markings on Ethan's hands glowed faintly in the dim light of the cabin. He had scrubbed at them with soap and water until his skin was raw, but the spirals and symbols remained, etched deep into his flesh like a brand. They pulsed softly, their glow rhythmic, as though mirroring the beat of his heart. Ethan sat at the small table, staring at his hands as the weight of what had happened settled over him. The forest had marked, him claimed him, as Yaw had warned, and he didn't know what that meant. The pull he had felt for days was stronger now, an almost physical force that tugged at him whenever he stood still for too long. It was as if the forest were calling him back, whispering promises he couldn't understand. Jean arrived just after dawn, his face lined with exhaustion. He didn't knock, didn't say a word as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He looked at Ethan's hands, his expression grim. "You touched it," Jean said, his voice low. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "I didn't mean to. It just happened." Jean let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "You've crossed a line, Hayes. One you can't uncross. What does it mean?" Ethan asked, holding up his hands. "Why me?" Jean pulled out a chair and sat across from him, his gaze steady. The forest doesn't pick people at random. It marks those it sees as necessary. Necessary for what? Ethan asked, his voice rising. I didn't ask for this. No one does, Jean said. But that doesn't change the fact that you're bound to this place now. The forest chose you for a reason. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. There has to be a way to stop this, to break the connection. Jean's expression darkened. There isn't. Once you're marked, the forest becomes a part of you, and you become a part of it. The day passed in a haze. Jean stayed with Ethan, his presence a small comfort against the growing sense of unease. They spoke little, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Jean's warnings echoed in Ethan's mind, each one more ominous than the last. The forest won't forget. The forest always takes what it's owed. By mid-afternoon, Ethan couldn't take the silence any longer. He grabbed his pack and rifle, ignoring Jean's protests as he stepped out onto the trail. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, but there was an edge to it, a tension that prickled against his skin. The pull was stronger now, guiding Ethan's steps as he moved deeper into the forest. He didn't try to fight it. The forest had marked him, claimed him, and there was no escaping it. If he wanted answers, he would have to face whatever waited for him in the shadows. The trees grew denser as Ethan walked, their trunks twisted and blackened as though scorched by some ancient fire. The light filtering through the canopy took on an eerie quality, shifting between golden and green hues that made the shadows dance. The air was colder here, heavy with the faint metallic tang that Ethan had come to associate with the spirals. He came across another cairn, smaller than the others, but no less significant. The stones were arranged in a perfect circle, their surfaces etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Ethan knelt down, running his fingers over the markings. They felt warm to the touch, almost alive. Ethan. The voice was soft, almost melodic. He stood quickly, his heart pounding as he scanned the forest around him. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. But he could feel the presence of something unseen, watching him from the shadows. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, only the faint rustling of leaves, but the pull grew stronger, drawing him away from the cairn and deeper into the forest. Ethan followed the pull for what felt like hours, the landscape shifting around him in strange and subtle ways. The trees grew taller, their branches intertwining overhead to form a natural archway. The ground beneath his feet was soft and spongy, covered in a thick layer of moss that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. He came to another clearing, this one larger than the others he had seen. At its center stood a massive tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted like the muscles of an ancient giant. Its branches stretched out in all directions, their tips curling like claws. The bark was dark and glistening, as though coated in a thin layer of sap. The tree pulsed with a soft, rhythmic light, the spirals carved into its surface glowing in time with Ethan's own heartbeat. The air around it was heavy, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. Ethan approached cautiously, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the tree. The moment his fingers brushed against the bark, the world around him shifted. Ethan found himself standing in a vast, endless forest, the trees stretching upward into a sky that pulsed with colors he couldn't name. The air was thick with mist, and the ground beneath his feet felt strange, like it wasn't entirely solid. The hum was everywhere now, resonating through his body like a second heartbeat. Shadows moved between the trees, their forms indistinct and fluid. Ethan couldn't tell if they were watching him, or merely passing through, but their presence was undeniable. Ethan. The whispers came, clearer now. You've come. The voice was soft, almost kind, but it sent a shiver down his spine. He turned, searching for the source, but the forest remained empty. What do you want from me? Ethan called out, his voice echoing in the strange, dreamlike space. To listen, the voice replied. To see. The ground beneath Ethan's feet shifted, and he stumbled, catching himself against a nearby tree. The bark was smooth and cold, and as he touched it, images flooded his mind. He saw the spirals, etched into stone and wood, their lines glowing with an ancient light. He saw the cairns, their patterns forming intricate maps that seemed to shift and change. And he saw the keepers, the shadowy figures that moved through the forest, their forms flickering like flame. Why me? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Because you are marked, the voice said. You are chosen. Ethan felt a surge of anger, his fear giving way to frustration. I didn't choose this, he shouted. I don't want this. The forest seemed to shudder, the hum growing louder. The shadows between the trees drew closer, their forms coalescing into something more solid. Ethan backed away, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. You cannot run, the voice said, its tone gentle but firm. You are bound to this place. Ethan wasn't sure how long he wandered through the strange forest. Time felt meaningless here, the sky above shifting between light and darkness without warning. The shadows followed him, always just out of reach, their presence a constant reminder that he was not alone. He came across another monolith, smaller than the first but no less imposing. Its surface was covered in spirals and symbols, the glow brighter now, almost blinding. Ethan approached cautiously, the hum vibrating through his bones. The whispers returned, soft and melodic. Ethan, listen. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the surface of the stone. The glow enveloped him, the symbols shifting and swirling as though alive. The hum grew louder, drowning out all other sounds. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Ethan opened his eyes to find himself back in the clearing. The tree was gone, replaced by the familiar trees of hollow pine. The air was still, the forest silent, but something had changed. Ethan looked down at his hands, his breath catching in his throat. The markings from the monolith were etched into his skin, faint but unmistakable. They pulsed with a soft light, the spirals and symbols glowing faintly in the dim forest light. He sank to his knees, his mind racing. The forest had marked him, claimed him in a way he didn't fully understand. There was no going back now. The forest had made its choice. Ethan sat on the porch of his cabin, staring at his hands. The markings had faded slightly in the daylight, but still glowed faintly whenever he moved. Their intricate lines and spirals seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting subtly as if they were alive. He couldn't stop tracing them with his fingers, hoping to find some explanation in their patterns. Jean's warnings echoed in his mind. The forest doesn't forget. It takes what it's owed. The weight of those words pressed heavily on him, but he still didn't understand what the forest wanted from him. He had spent hours reading the journal, searching for answers, but the entries only raised more questions. The journal's last few pages were particularly troubling. They spoke of something called the Keeper's Threshold, a boundary that marked the forest's deepest, and most dangerous places. According to the entries, the threshold was guarded by the keepers, the shadowy figures Ethan had seen in the woods. They were described as ancient, unknowable beings that existed to maintain the forest's balance. The markings on Ethan's hands matched the descriptions of the keepers' sigils, symbols said to bind those chosen by the forest to its will. The thought made Ethan's stomach churn. He didn't want to be part of this. He didn't want to be Mark, but it was too late for that now. Jean arrived just before noon, his face lined with exhaustion. He had been spending more time in the field than usual, checking trails and markers as if preparing for something. Ethan couldn't help but notice the tension in the older ranger's movements, the way his eyes darted to the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. "You look like hell," Jean said, dropping his pack on the porch. "Thanks," Ethan muttered, his tone dry. He held up his hands. "They're not going away." Jean's expression darkened. "They won't." "Great," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "So, what now? Do I just wander the forest until it decides to finish whatever it started?" Jean didn't answer right away. He sat down beside Ethan, pulling a flask from his pocket and taking a long swig. "The forest has a purpose for you," he said finally. "It wouldn't have marked you otherwise." "And what purpose is that?" Ethan asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What could it possibly want from me?" Jean let out a heavy sigh, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It wants you to cross the threshold." Ethan frowned. "The Keeper's threshold? I read about it in the journal. What is it?" Jean hesitated, then said, "It's a place where the forest's influence is strongest. The boundary between our world and something else." "Something else," Ethan repeated, his tone skeptical. Jean nodded. "I've seen it once. It's not a place you can find on your own. The forest has to guide you there. And once you cross it, you're not the same." Ethan stared at him, his mind racing. "What happens if I don't go?" Jean's jaw tightened. "You don't have a choice, Hayes. The forest will take you there, one way or another." The forest began calling him again that evening. The pull was stronger now, more insistent, tugging at his chest like an invisible thread. Ethan tried to ignore it, but the sensation grew unbearable, like a constant pressure building inside him. By nightfall, he couldn't resist it any longer. Jean watched him from the porch as he grabbed his pack and rifle. "You're going, aren't you?" the older ranger asked. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. "I don't think I have a choice." Jean stood, his expression unreadable. "You don't, but you don't have to do this alone." Ethan blinked, surprised. "You're coming with me." Jean nodded. "Someone has to make sure you don't get yourself killed." They left the cabin together, the pull guiding Ethan's steps, as Jean followed close behind. The forest was darker than usual, its shadows deeper and more pronounced. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches intertwining overhead to block out the moonlight. The pull led them off the main trail, into an area of the park that Ethan had never seen before. The air grew colder, carrying the faint metallic tang that had become all too familiar. The hum returned as well, low and resonant, vibrating through the ground with every step they took. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached a clearing. Ethan stopped at the edge, his breath catching in his throat. The clearing was massive, its boundaries marked by towering stone monoliths arranged in a circle. Each monolith was etched with spirals and symbols, their lines glowing faintly in the darkness. At the center of the clearing was a large stone archway, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The archway pulsed with light, the glow shifting between shades of blue and green. The air around it felt charged, like the atmosphere before a storm. There, the threshold, Jean said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's where the forest wants you to go. Ethan stared at the archway, his heart pounding. What's on the other side? I don't know, Jean admitted, but once you cross it, there's no turning back. Ethan approached the archway cautiously, his hands trembling. The markings on his skin began to glow brighter as he drew closer, their light matching the rhythm of the archway's pulse. The hum grew louder, resonating through his entire body. Jean stayed at the edge of the clearing, his rifle in hand. Be careful, Hayes. Ethan nodded, his focus fixed on the archway. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the carvings. The stone was cool to the touch, its surface smooth and flawless despite its age. The moment his hand made contact, the world shifted. Ethan found himself standing in a place that defied explanation. The forest was still there, but it was different, larger, more alive. The trees towered above him, their trunks glowing faintly with the same spirals that marked his skin. The ground was covered in moss that pulsed with light, and the air was thick with a sweet, heady scent. Shadows moved between the trees, their forms indistinct and fluid. They seemed to watch him, their presence both comforting and unnerving. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through his chest like a second heartbeat. Ethan, the whispers came, clearer than ever. You've come. He turned, searching for the source of the voice. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting and flickering like a flame. It was one of the keepers, its glowing eyes fixed on him. You are the bridge, the keeper said, its voice resonant and melodic. The balance must be restored. The bridge? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. What does that mean? The keeper tilted its head, its expression unreadable. You will see. The ground beneath Ethan's feet began to shift, and he stumbled, catching himself against a nearby tree. The bark was warm, pulsing with the same light as the moss. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as the world around him began to blur. The last thing he saw before the light consumed him was the keeper, its glowing eyes filled with something that might have been sorrow or hope. Ethan opened his eyes to find himself back in the clearing, the archway behind him. The markings on his skin had faded, their glow dimmed to almost nothing. Jean was at his side, his expression a mix of relief and concern. What happened? Jean asked, helping Ethan to his feet. I don't know, Ethan said, his voice shaky, but I think I'm part of it now. Jean nodded slowly. You are, and so is the forest. They stood in silence, the weight of the moment settling over them. The threshold had changed Ethan in ways he couldn't yet comprehend, but one thing was certain: hollow pines would never let him go. Ethan didn't speak for the rest of the night. After stepping through the threshold and returning to the clearing, his mind was consumed by fragments of what he'd seen and felt in the otherworldly forest. The keeper's words echoed in his thoughts. You are the bridge. The balance must be restored. Jean stayed close, giving him space, but keeping a watchful eye. Ethan could feel the older ranger's concern, though Jean never voiced it. The clearing was still and quiet, the monoliths standing as silent sentinels around the threshold. Their faint glow had dimmed, as though they, too, were waiting. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, Jean finally broke the silence. We should head back, he said, his voice gruff. There's nothing more to do here. Ethan nodded numbly, his legs feeling heavy as he followed Jean out of the clearing. But even as they walked, he felt the pull of the forest stronger now, more insistent. It wasn't finished with him. The cabin felt smaller than ever when they returned, its walls pressing in around Ethan like a cage. He couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, even here. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside made his nerves fray further. Jean set a pot of coffee on the stove, his movements deliberate and methodical. "You should rest," he said without looking at Ethan. "You've been through a lot." "Rest," Ethan repeated, his voice hollow. He sat at the table, staring at his hands. The markings had faded further, but he could still feel them beneath his skin, like a second layer of veins. "How am I supposed to rest when I don't even know what's happening to me?" Jean didn't respond right away. He poured 2 mugs of coffee and set one in front of Ethan before taking the chair across from him. "The forest doesn't explain itself," he said finally. "It doesn't give you answers. It gives you choices." Ethan frowned, gripping the mug tightly. "What kind of choices?" "The kind that change you," Jean said, his gaze heavy. "The kind that make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself." Ethan looked down at his hands, the faint glow of the markings casting soft shadows on the table. "And if I don't make a choice? If I try to leave?" Jean's expression darkened. "The forest won't let you. Not now." The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan tried to lose himself in the monotony of his duties, patrolling the trails and checking the markers, but the forest seemed determined to remind him of its presence. The pull was constant now, a low hum in the back of his mind that grew stronger whenever he stopped moving. The spirals appeared everywhere he went, etched into rocks, carved into trees, even drawn faintly in the dirt of the trails. Each one seemed to call to him, their lines shifting subtly when he wasn't looking. The hum would grow louder whenever he neared them, vibrating through his chest like a second heartbeat. One afternoon, while checking a section of the southern trail, Ethan stumbled upon another cairn. This one was different from the others, larger, more elaborate. The stones were arranged in a spiraling pattern that extended outward, covering a wide circle of ground. At the center stood a single, upright stone, its surface etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dappled sunlight. Ethan knelt beside the cairn, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface of one of the stones. The markings pulsed beneath his touch, and for a moment, the hum in his mind grew deafening. "Ethan," the whisper came from behind him, soft and melodic. He turned quickly, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. The forest stood silent, its shadows deep and impenetrable. "Ethan," the voice came again, closer this time. "You must listen." Ethan stood, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The air grew colder, and the hum shifted, becoming a low, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The shadows between the trees coalesced, forming the shape of a figure tall and indistinct, its form flickering like a flame. "You are the bridge," the figure said, its voice layered and echoing. "You must restore the balance." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. "What balance? What are you talking about?" The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes fixed on him. "The forest remembers," it said. "The harm, the loss, the imbalance must be mended." Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. "I don't understand." "You will," the figure said, "when the time comes." The shadows dissolved, the figure vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The forest fell silent once more, the hum receding to a faint vibration in the back of Ethan's mind. When Ethan returned to the cabin that evening, Jean was waiting for him on the porch. The older ranger's expression was grim, his eyes shadowed with concern. "You saw one of them, didn't you?" Jean asked as Ethan climbed the steps. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. It said I was the bridge, that I had to restore the balance. Jean let out a heavy sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "They've chosen you," he said. "You're part of this now, whether you like it or not." "What does that even mean?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. "How am I supposed to restore balance to a forest that's already alive? What am I supposed to do?" Jean's gaze was steady. "You listen. You let the forest guide." Ethan shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. "That's not an answer. It's the only one you're going to get," Jean said, his tone firm. "The forest doesn't explain itself, Hayes. It doesn't give you a roadmap. It gives you a path, and you either walk it or you don't. And what happens if I don't?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jean's expression darkened. "Then the forest takes you." That night, the whispers returned. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the faint voices filled the room. They were soft and melodic, weaving through his thoughts like a song, but beneath their gentle tones was an urgency, a plea he couldn't ignore. "Ethan," they called. "Come back." He sat up, his chest tight as he looked toward the window. The forest was waiting for him, its pull stronger than ever. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, aching need to return to the spirals, to the cairns, to the threshold. He grabbed his rifle and pack, his movements automatic as he stepped out into the cool night air. The forest greeted him with its usual stillness, the shadows deep and inviting. The pull guided his steps, leading him off the trail and into the heart of hollow pines. The spirals glowed faintly as he passed, their light growing brighter with each step. The hum grew louder, resonating through his body until it became a part of him, as natural as his own heartbeat. Ethan didn't know where he was going, but he didn't care. The forest had called him, and he would answer. Ethan moved through the forest as if in a trance, his steps guided by an unseen force. The pull was stronger than ever, an unrelenting tug that urged him deeper into hollow pines. The spirals glowed brighter as he passed, their light illuminating the trees in strange, flickering patterns. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through his chest with every step. The night felt alive. The air was thick with energy, crackling like static electricity, and the shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move. Ethan gripped his rifle tightly, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against the forces he now faced. The path opened into a clearing Ethan had never seen before. It was massive, its edges lined with towering monoliths that stretched high into the night sky. Each one was etched with spirals and symbols that glowed like embers, their light casting eerie patterns across the ground. At the center of the clearing stood the tree. It was unlike any tree Ethan had ever seen. Its trunk was impossibly wide, gnarled and twisted like the muscles of some ancient titan. Its bark glistened with sap that glowed faintly in the darkness, and its branches stretched high above, intertwining to form a dome-like canopy. The spirals carved into its surface pulsed with light, their rhythm matching the beat of Ethan's heart. The hum was deafening here, a constant vibration that filled the air and rattled his bones. Ethan felt as though he was standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, a force beyond human comprehension. As he approached the tree, the air grew colder. His breath came in shallow gasps, each exhalation visible in the frigid air. The pull was almost unbearable now, dragging him forward with every step. The whispers returned, soft and melodic, weaving through his thoughts like a song. "Ethan, you've come." He stopped at the base of the tree, his hands trembling. The markings on his skin glowed brighter now, their light almost blinding. He reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing against the bark. The moment he touched the tree, the world shifted. Ethan was no longer in the clearing. He stood in a vast, endless expanse, the ground beneath him soft and glowing with faint spirals that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky above pulsed with shifting colors, hues that defied description. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, mixed with something sweet and metallic. The hum was everywhere, resonating through the ground, the air, and his own body. Shadows moved in the distance, their forms fluid and ever-changing. Ethan could feel their presence, their eyes watching him from just beyond the edge of his vision. "You are the bridge," the whispers came, clearer now. The balance must be restored. The shadows coalesced, forming a figure that stepped forward. It was one of the keepers, its form tall and indistinct, its glowing eyes fixed on Ethan. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space like heat rising from asphalt. "What do you want from me?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "To mend what was broken," the keeper said, its voice layered and echoing. "The forest remembers the harm, the loss, the imbalance." Ethan frowned, his mind racing. What imbalance? What harm? The keeper tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. The forest was whole, its boundaries strong, but they were weakened by greed, by fear, by those who sought to control what cannot be controlled. Ethan thought of the journal, of the entries that spoke of loggers and settlers who had vanished in the forest, their camps destroyed and their tools left to rust. The spirals, the cairns, they weren't just markers, they were warnings. "You must restore the boundary," the keeper said. "You must become the bridge." Ethan shook his head, his pulse racing. "I don't know how." The keeper extended a hand, its long, shadowy fingers pointing to the markings on Ethan's skin. "You are marked. You are chosen. The forest will guide you." The world shifted again, and Ethan found himself back in the clearing. The tree loomed before him, its spirals glowing brighter than ever. The hum had receded slightly, though it still vibrated faintly in the background, a reminder of the power that surrounded him. Jean stood at the edge of the clearing, his expression a mix of concern and resignation. He didn't speak, didn't move, as Ethan approached the tree once more. The markings on Ethan's skin began to pulse, their light syncing with the spirals on the tree. The pull intensified, dragging him forward until he stood directly beneath the tree's gnarled branches. The whispers returned, soft and melodic, weaving through his thoughts. "Ethan, restore the balance." He closed his eyes, his hands trembling as he placed them against the tree. The moment he made contact, the markings on his skin flared to life, their light spreading outward in a cascade of energy. The spirals on the tree responded, their glow intensifying until the entire clearing was bathed in a brilliant, pulsating light. The hum grew louder, filling the air with its resonant vibration. Ethan felt the energy coursing through him, a powerful force that threatened to overwhelm him. His mind was flooded with images, flashes of the forest as it once was, whole and untouched. He saw the spirals forming, the cairns being built, the keepers standing watch over the boundaries. And then he saw the destruction. Trees felled, rivers polluted, the forest's boundaries weakened by human greed and carelessness. The balance had been shattered, and the forest had been fighting to restore it ever since. Ethan's body ached with the weight of the energy coursing through him. He could feel the forest's pain, its anger, its desperation, but he could also feel its hope. "You are the bridge," the whispers said. "You are the key." With a final surge of light, the energy flowed from Ethan's body into the tree. The spirals flared brightly, their light spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The hum reached its peak, a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath him. And then, silence. Ethan opened his eyes to find the clearing bathed in soft, golden light. The spirals on the tree had dimmed, their glow now a gentle pulse that matched the rhythm of the forest around him. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of pine and moss. Gene approached cautiously, his expression one of awe. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan shook his head, his mind still reeling. "I don't know," he said, "but I think it's done." The pool was gone, the constant hum that had followed Ethan for days now a faint memory. The markings on his skin had faded completely, leaving only faint scars as a reminder of what he had experienced. The forest was still, its presence no longer oppressive, but comforting. Ethan could feel its gratitude, its quiet relief. The balance had been restored. Ethan stayed on as a ranger at Hollow Pines, though his role had changed. The forest no longer pulled at him, no longer whispered in his mind, but he remained vigilant, watching for signs that the balance might falter again. Gene retired a few months later, leaving the park in Ethan's care. On his last day, he handed Ethan the journal, its pages filled with the accounts of rangers who had come before him. "You've earned this," Gene said, his voice filled with pride. "Take care of this place, Hayes. It's yours now." Ethan nodded, his grip on the journal tightening. He watched as Jean disappeared down the trail, his figure fading into the trees. The forest was quiet as Ethan turned and headed back to the cabin. The spirals, the cairns, the threshold, they were all part of him now, just as he was part of the forest. And he would protect it, no matter the cost.